Hello and welcome to another edition of the podcast. Today, we will be talking about racism in general in the UK, specifically Tower Hamlets. So we have a special guest today. His name is Ansar Ahmed Ullah, and he is an expert on racism. He did a thesis recently on racism. So very soon, um, obviously, he will be given the doctorate title. So it will be a doctorate in racism. So welcome to the show, Ansar Bhai. How are you?
Thank you for having me in your show today. And I want to say from the outset, I'm no expert in racism. My background is a community worker, and
Sure.
I've lived in the borough for the last, I guess, 40 odd years.
Sure. Yes, obviously Ansar Bhai is, is a very active person in the community, especially in Tower Hamlets. He's well known. He's actually involved with many organizations that I know of. Obviously, we'll try to cover because it's only half an hour show, so we'll try to cover as much as possible. How racism came about, how it was sort of 30, 40 years ago, how it has evolved over the years, and how it is now. Obviously, I want to pay tribute to Al-Tabali, who died from racism. He hailed from the area called Satok, in the greatest Sylhet region of Bangladesh. He was murdered on the 4th of May. May Allah grant him Jannah. So with that in mind, obviously we'll be covering the Battle of Cable Street as well. If you can just touch on that, Ansar Bhai, and racism in general. So, Ansar Bhai, I mean, how did you sort of become involved in activism, yeah, especially anti-racist movements?
Well, as I mentioned, I've been living here for a long time. In fact, I came to East London in 1980. Following the murder of Al-Tawali. As you mentioned, Al-Tawali was murdered in 1978, and I arrived just 2 years after his racist murder. I have been in this area since 1980. Um, and sorry, what was your
Where were you
question?
before that? You see, you said you came here in 1980. Where were you
To
before
to
that?
to East London, yes. Um, uh, I was in a small town in Luton before that.
Yeah.
I came to join my father, who had been in the UK since the 50s. He first settled in the Midlands in Birmingham, and then he moved down to Luton. So I, with my mum, my two sister and brother, came to join him in the sort of late 70s in Luton, where he had his business. And from there, I came to East London in 1980.
Oh, okay. And so, how did you sort of get involved in anti-racist movements?
Okay, so when I came to East London, as I said, this was just 2 years after 78, and most of the activists who had led the anti-racist movement following Al-Tawali's death were had formalized themselves into youth groups. So at that time, there were mainly 5 youth groups that spearheaded the movement of anti-racism. Um, and I should mention them. There was the Bangladesh Youth Front, Bangladesh Youth Association, Bangladesh Youth Movement, Bangladesh Youth League, and the Progressive Youth Organization. So by 1980, the youth activists, I think they decided to move away from street agitation to take the fight or the challenge to the institution in order to challenge institutional racism. And in order to do that, they then came together to form an umbrella body of all the youth groups. So the 5 youth groups that I just mentioned, as well as groups outside London, groups from Hackney and beyond London, like youth group from Luton, from Birmingham, from Bradford, from Newcastle, Walsall, even as far as Sunderland. They all came together to form the Federation of Bangladeshi Youth Organizations, in short known as FBYO. So I came to work for them, and as a result, I became embroiled in community activism. I got to know all the community activists who were very active in 1978 and in the following decades. So I guess that's how I became involved in community and youth work.
Yeah. So obviously the East End, or specifically Tower Hamlets, has always been a place for immigrants. We know from history initially the Irish settled here when they first started coming, I think just over 100 years ago. And then the Jews started settling here. And then after the Jews, it was the Bengalis. Um, every single community went through racism, the Irish, the Jews, and the Bengalis. Um, do you think that the Bengalis had a bit more hard time, in terms of like settling down?
It's difficult to say, but as you mentioned, Tower Hamlets or East London has always been a place where migrant groups have come and settled, and made this place their home. And of course, as you said, the first migrants were the Irish, who were fleeing the potato famine, who came here first. And then you had the French Huguenot community who were fleeing persecution in France. And then, of course, the Jewish community also came to Tower Hamlets. And finally, the Bengali community. I think the Irish had to face a lot of prejudice, and there were anti-Irish riots in East London. There were also prejudice against the Jewish community, and I think we all know of the famous Battle of Cable Street in 1936, when the local Jewish community with the local working class people, as well as the Irish dockers, collectively build resistance against the fascist at the Cable Street. With the Bengali community, I think perhaps the community first started to face racism, I would say perhaps from mid-70s, perhaps from 74, 75. And we know that there were a number of active organizations around that period. So in 1976, we had obviously the Bangladesh Welfare Association was around. The youth groups did not exist then. It was just the Bangladesh Welfare Association and some of our elders. And there was a group called the anti-racist community of Asians in East London, which was formed in 1976, opposing the murder of a local Arab student and 2 Asians. And then, of course, 78, which then led to formation of Action Committee Against Racial Attacks, which was led by the Bangladesh Welfare Associations, Brick Lane Mosque, and the 5 youth groups that I mentioned. So I think perhaps by the mid-70s, as the number of Bengalis started to grow and we became more visible, and I think we have to take into account of the political situation at that time. Britain was facing high unemployment. The East End of London was had severe deprivation, poverty. So the far right used the Bengalis as a scapegoat for all their ills. They started blaming the Bengali community, for example, that the Bengalis were taking their jobs, they were taking their homes. And I think as a result, there was a lot of resentment from the local white working class people against the Bengalis who were arriving here in East London. And the far right group was the National Front at the time, who would come to this area every Sunday to spread their literature of hatred. But often the Bengalis faced violence, not so much from the organized far-right group, but mainly often from their own neighbors. You know, Bengali families would suffer from their windows being broken, rubbish being put through the letterbox, the kids being harassed, women being harassed, and these were daily occurrence. And of course, there was also violence at times. And you mentioned Altabali. Altabali wasn't the first to be murdered. Within a month, in the neighboring Hackney, another Bengali called Ishaq Ali was murdered. Um, and if we go further back, we know of another Bengali worker who was murdered in 1970 in Bow. Again, he was returning from work and he was set upon by a number of youth who knifed him and killed him. In 78, apart from Bengalis, in January in neighboring Newham, I think it was only 10-year-old, a Sikh boy by the name of Kenneth Singh was again, murdered by racists. In the same year, in December, in the neighboring Hackney, a West Indian young man by the name of Michael Ferreira was also killed. So, Bengalis were facing violence, not just in East London, but across UK, where, there was a large Bengali population. And not only Bengalis, I think at that time, during the 70s, Black and Asian people were facing racial violence across the UK, not just in East London. But I think in East London, because there were, large Bengali population, it was easy for the far-right group to target us. Hence, they would come here every Sunday to harass us, to abuse us, to distribute their literature, and often end up in violence.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you saw the Labour government, which was in the 70s, and then subsequently the Tories came in. I think obviously I came in the 80s. I had my fair share of racism. Oh, I'll go into that later on. Do you see a difference, like when Labour governed the country and when Conservatives governed the country in terms of racism?
Um, I mean, there are, of course, ideological differences, but I think when it comes to practicality,
Mm.
uh, I think it really made no difference to
Mm.
our community.
Mm.
In fact, I remember during the 80s, following the anti-racist movement, when the Bengalis felt that they need to be part of mainstream, in order to bring about meaningful changes to their community, they decided to join political parties. Obviously, in East London, the Labour Party has had a stronghold, you know, for a very long time.
Mm.
So it was obvious that the Bengalis felt that in order to, bring about changes, they needed to join the Labour Party. However, when they decided to do that, they soon realized that there was some kind of a barrier, or there was a reluctance to accept Bengali membership into the Labour Party. Um, and I think for months, for years, they struggled, and the Labour Party would not accept them. The Labour Party would not even nominate them to be councillor. And you probably know this, the first Bengali councillor to, elected from Townlets was an independent person by the name
Mm.
of Ruhul Amin in 1982.
Mm.
But I should also add that the Labour Party, from the Labour Party, Ashik Ali also got elected in the same year from St. Catherine. However, the Bengalis wanted somebody to be elected from Spitalfields, because Spitalfields still has the highest concentration of Bengali population. Despite that, the Labour Party refused to, select or nominate a Bengali candidate. Hence, Nurul Haq got elected from Spitalfields.
Mm.
So I think I don't think anybody favored the Bengali community. We had to struggle at every stage, and it took, I don't know, decades before Rushna Ali got elected in 2010, I guess.
2020.
So it's been a long drawn struggle. I don't think any party has favored us or given us on a plate, so to speak. Um, I can't say really whether the Labour Party or the Conservative Party has been more favorable. So I think we had to struggle with all the parties in order to,
Yeah, I
become.
mean, to be fair on the Labour Party,
Yeah,
obviously, if you look at the stats, there are more BAME communities who do support Labour for
yeah,
many reasons. And I
yeah,
think Labour has the most number of like elected representatives from the BAME community.
yes.
So I think, they have this
Of
advantage.
course.
And
I
when it,
mean,
when it comes to
that's also,
representation, um, even if you look across London, we have a BAME mayor, Sadiq Khan,
yeah, yeah.
from the Labour Party. We have most of the councillors are from the Labour Party within the London region.
Well,
And
this
for-
is what
yeah,
you would expect because the Labour Party is a party that has socialism as one of
yeah,
its values.
yeah,
The Labour Party is for the underdog, for the poor people,
yeah.
and most of BAME community they tend to live in poor areas.
Mm.
Hence, they also tend to become members of the Labour Party, and hence you have a very large number of people who are councillors or member of parliament are from the Labour Party.
Mm.
But as I said, our community had to struggle. It wasn't a easy way.
Yeah, it was a long struggle, and I still remember, like, although I was growing up in the 80s, personally, I've had my fair share of racism every day, literally. We used to be called the P word, and I'm sure you know what that is. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Every day,
yeah.
there was racism in every sphere of life, especially when it comes to when it came to employment. People had difficulties. When people used to ring the police up when they needed assistance, the police never responded. I know a lot of
Mhm.
businessmen, like in the back in the 80s, in 90s, when almost every other weekend, goons used to come into restaurants and like smash everything up, and
Yeah,
owners used to call the police. The police never came. you know
no,
that's how
no,
bad it
no.
was. So employment, even like opening bank accounts. So I remember in the 80s it was very difficult. Even the banks were racist institutionally. So the institutional racism is still here, but the on the face racism, I think, has died, is dying out. It's still
I,
there
I,
in many parts of the country, but
I would agree
in
with
same
you.
concentrated areas, we don't see that. Like my children, they don't even know what they've never actually felt it, which is a good thing. They've
Yeah, of
never actually
course, of
felt
course.
racism, so they don't even know what racism is. But
Yeah,
they do understand and they do realize that there is institutional racism out there in every sphere of life. If you look at the Met, we have something like, I think, about more than 30% of the
hmm,
residents who live in London who are of BAME community. But when it comes to the Met Police, only 2% are BAME within the force. So
yeah,
that's something I think where the Met really needs to work on. There's still a lot of struggle, a lot of things to improve within society. Um, but institutional racism is still rife in our society, and like previous generations, whenever you get new generations coming into this country, I'm sure they face similar
yeah, yeah, yeah,
racism and similar issues. In terms of like public representation, yeah, elected representation, like. It was a hard struggle. It wasn't until I think 2010 when
yeah,
we had Rushna Ali being elected as the first Bengali MP, which is a great achievement. But you know,
yeah,
but then again, before Rushna Ali, we had this guy called George Galloway. He was a independent. He had his
yeah,
own little party. So he came in, and before that, it was Una King who
yeah,
represented the Labour Party. So we had Rushnarli in 2010, and then in 2014 or 15, when we had the election, we had Rupa Hawk, not Chilips, sorry, Rupa Hawk, and who's the other one? Yeah, Rupa Hawk. And I think
yeah,
Tulip Siddiqui became the MP in 2019. So
yeah,
yeah, so this was the third Bengali female MP. And then in 2019, sorry, we had Apsana Begum as well from Poplar and Limehouse. So we
She's
had
the
four.
last one, yeah,
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 last one. So we had
latest.
four basically in 2019. So yeah, things have changed, for the better. Um, but we still need a male MP, don't we? In terms of gender balance,
Yeah, yeah,
I
of
think
course.
the Pakistani and the Indian communities are doing far more better. They have many MPs across the country. They have like something like Indian community has 20, 25 MPs. Pakistani community has about 20 MPs. So we
Yeah,
really need to work on that as a community, you know. Uh,
we have a long way to go.
yeah, I
Yes.
mean, we have one male Scottish MP, Faisal Chadli.
Yeah.
I'm sure you know.
Yes.
I've met
Yeah.
him last year, basically. We went down to the Parliament. He invited us very kindly. So we did a tour
Hmm.
and then we invited him back to Tower Hamlets. We gave him
I was at that
a
event
Oh,
in
yeah,
Kingsley
you
Hall.
got
Yes.
it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think it's very important that actually we participate in mainstream politics, regardless of which party wants a
Yeah.
board. It's very important because that's the only way you can actually have a voice in power,
Yeah.
and make changes. Um, so yeah, I mean, I remember like when we used to in the 80s when we used to go out playing in the parks, we used to be attacked. Especially I remember on a Sundays like like the Sunday market. Yeah. So it was very
Yeah.
popular in the 80s and 70s.
Yeah.
80s, I remember we used to go to Sunday market and almost every other Sunday we used to be attacked and coming back from
Yeah.
the, you know. Um, so at that time, the National Front, they were very
Yeah.
active. And then
Yeah.
gradually the National Front died out. And then I
Yeah.
think the BNP came, the British National Party. They were
Yeah. Yeah.
wreaking havoc all over towns and all over, England. And I think that there was a period in the 90s, mid 90s, where the BNP actually won a good number of seats in the Isle of Dogs, which was
Mm.
very worrying, you know. So at least thank God it's a thing of the past right now. We don't see much of that. But then after time, they did very well in Barking, more east of London. They
Yeah.
did very
Yeah.
well in Barking in the local elections. But recently, they're not as popular as they should be. But we still see racism online, institutional racism in every sphere. Uh,
Yeah.
so um,
I
uh,
mean, you're right. I mean, the violence has subsided, and I think it probably, I would say, probably subsided by '94, with the defeat of BNP councillor Derek Beacon, who
oh
got
yeah,
elected.
Derek Weekend. Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah.
He was the one that got elected in Isle of Dogs, and I think with the back of him gone from this area, I think the BNP also left, or we did not see their presence anymore. And you mentioned Sunday Market. It was the BNP that used to come on every Sunday at the top end of Brick Lane to
Mhm.
sell their racist literature.
Mhm.
So yeah, I mean, with the National Front, we had them from the 70s till I think 82 maybe, and then they stopped coming to Brick Lane. However, like you said, throughout the 80s, there were lots of racial violence within Tower Hamlets. Uh, the community, like you said, I mean, I don't know if you went to school locally.
Yeah, I went to a local school. Yeah.
I spoke to many activists who went to schools locally in the 70s, late 70s, and everyone talked about being bullied, robbed,
Mm.
beaten up by racists. And I think it probably continued throughout the 80s in some schools, not every school.
Mm.
And again, like you said, I think by mid 90s, it kind of died down. However, before that, we had the attack on Quddus Ali
Mm.
in
Yeah,
93, I think,
yeah,
probably,
yeah,
and Mukhtar Ahmed the
yeah.
next year.
Mm.
Um, but I think today the violence is no longer there. But from time to time, you can sense underlying tension of racism, and every now and then it does raise its ugly head.
Mm.
And I think we are seeing this again today with the issues around Palestine.
Mm.
I think many far right activists see pro-Palestinian supporter as being either as Asians or Muslims, hence they're opposed to anybody who is seen as a supporter of of Palestine. So I think nowadays it's a bit more complex, whereas before it was simply black and white. Nowadays, racism can have its many different forms, and can affect different communities. So you might face prejudice because perhaps you might belong to, I don't know, LGBT community or disabled community, or because of your faith, whereas previously it was just because of your race. So I think it's become far more complex now. And as you said, it's also to do with the institutions themselves. And unless the institutions address those issues, I think we will still carry on seeing these kind of, conflict
Hmm.
between groups and communities.
Yeah, I remember Ansar, right?
Yeah,
At school, like when we used to be sort of attacked or spat upon, like the teachers, they just used to watch and they never took any action, would you believe?
yeah,
And
yeah. I
it was so
mean,
bad, like in general violence, like there was to be stabbing every day in my local school. I don't want to tell say the name, but I think
no,
this was common amongst a lot of the schools in the East End. You know,
yeah,
Even if you reported a hate attack to
yeah.
the teacher, they just used to sort of, uh, you know, uh, just avoid it.
I
Totally.
mean, like I said,
Um,
some of the activists that I've
yeah,
spoken to,
yeah.
all of them had experienced racism. Some of them got beaten up the first day at school. Some even had to move out of this area.
Mhm.
For some, their parents had to even take them back to Bangladesh because they just couldn't cope with the violence.
Mhm.
Some had developed way of safeguarding themselves. So what they would do is, if they're in the playground, when the bell went off, they would follow a teacher, hopefully, so
Right.
that they would not get beaten up.
Yeah, yeah.
Or, but sometimes that didn't work. Like you said, some of the teachers would not be very, helpful, or they just ignore the issues. Um, so I think it was a very difficult period for our community,
Hmm.
definitely during the late 70s and perhaps early
Yeah, I
80s.
mean, I remember like obviously after I came in the 80s, I think it was in the 70s, it was quite prevalent where a
Yeah,
lot of they used to see a lot of signs like saying no, like especially when it came to like letting properties, like no blacks, no Irish, and no dogs. But I
yeah,
think that died off in the 80s. Yeah. Um,
yeah, yeah,
so that was a like, phenomenon back in the 70s. And also like one thing I've realized, Ansar, right, like how the name changes over time. Like initially in the 70s, it was the National Front. Then in the 90s, it was, the same people became BNP.
yeah.
Same people changed their names. And now it's EDL, isn't it? Yeah.
EDL, Britain first, and
Britain
yeah,
First. Yeah, no, sorry,
yeah,
Britain First was before EDL. And now EDL was the last one.
yeah,
Britain
yeah,
First, I think we still have them. But EDL was the last one. But another like a thing that has changed, and that is like before, like every other Asian was a P, basically.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Now, every other Asian is a Muslim. You know,
Or
the
Islamist,
elitism
yeah,
is more targeted towards the Muslim. So I don't know
yeah.
how this came about, how the P word came about, like how everyone was called a P. You
I
know.
think the P word came about, it was a shortening of Pakistani,
Yeah, yeah, I know. Yeah,
because,
but obviously there was more Indians here than Pakistanis, so I don't know why the
I
hatred for
think
Pakistan.
for the races, it was difficult to differentiate between the three different South Asian groups. They couldn't really tell the difference who was a Indian or a Pakistani or a Bengali. For
Pakistan.
them,
They
all
know that
Asian
they're all Pakistanis. Yeah,
were a P and was a target,
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah. So and obviously now we still have institutional racism in all sectors. In our
yeah.
society. And racism, like we see especially Muslim people who wear Muslim attire, they get profiled easily by authorities, especially at
Mm,
airports. Like from my experience, I've seen every time I go abroad and come back, it's usually 90% of the people are Muslims. You can
mm,
easily tell they're wearing Muslim attires you know.
Yeah.
So the racism is more really, towards the Muslim communities. That's how it's changed. And obviously, the average racist thinks of every other Asian as a Muslim. They don't really, even the Sikhs, like, they get attacked because
Yeah.
they can't tell the difference. They think
No.
Sikhs are Muslims. Now, I remember like a few years ago, Sikhs had to come out with placards saying we are not Muslims. And can you imagine these, like, people, the average racists, they were probably thinking, hold on, what's going on? And they were probably confused, because they can't
Yeah.
tell
Yeah.
the difference between a Sikh and a Muslim with a beard.
Yeah.
To
Yeah.
them, they're all the same, aren't they?
Yeah, yeah. So, I
Yeah.
mean, you're right. I mean, Black Asians, we have been a target of the racists for a very long time. And regardless what they call us,
Yeah,
whether they call us Asians or P or Muslims,
exactly.
we have been a target and we still are, unfortunately. I mean, of course, the violence is no longer here, but I think, as you mentioned, the institutions do profile us. And, through the profiling, if they wish to, they can definitely discriminate,
Mhm.
hold you back. Oh, yeah, I mean, all that I mean, it's more difficult now to, unless you have the evidence to say that it's happening.
Yeah.
But I think we, as a member of Black and Asian community, we are very much aware because we are, sufferer of this racism. And as you said, I think you'll find every member within our community
Yeah.
who would say that and agree with you that we are still facing some form of racism, though it may not be violent
Mm.
at this moment in time, but it's still out there. Yes, definitely.
Yeah. Um, I was gonna say, like, how things have moved on for the better, obviously. I'd rather live now than like 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah,
But well, I'm so, like, glad and proud in a way. Like, we're living at a time. We have
yeah,
two Bengali MPs, one Bengali independent mayor, and then we have Rishi Sunak, as
yeah,
being Prime Minister. And then recently we had the Scottish um, First Minister,
yeah.
in person, and then the Labour leader of Scotland is also, a Bain person. So it's a good time to live, and at least things have improved for the better, And I think, we can only hope like things will only get better in the future.
Oh,
But this
definitely.
didn't come along easily. Our forefathers, elders really had to fight for it. They had
Yeah.
to, like, fight, and face so many obstacles along the way, during over the years. So it wasn't easy. So I pay tribute. I respect. I give my respects to all the activists who actually went out of their way to
Yeah.
establish a decent, environment for us now. Because a lot of the young generation, they probably don't even know what it feels like to be a victim of racism. You know,
Yeah.
because you can't really tell until and unless you're a victim.
Yeah.
So yeah, so with that in mind, I think we'll
Yeah.
end it. We've only got a minute. So any final thoughts, Ansar bhai?
Yeah, I think, like you said, definitely we are at a place which is far better than we were in the 70s or 80s. As you said, your daughter probably wouldn't know what racism is.
Exactly.
Um, so I think we're definitely going forward. And as you said, we currently have four members in the Parliament. We have one member in the House of Lords. We have a member in the Scottish Assembly. And I think Timeless probably has the largest number of Bengali
Yeah,
Asian
Bengali
councillors
councillors.
in the
Yeah,
whole of the country.
yeah.
And there are other role models within the mainstream. There are many Bengalis in the mainstream press and media,
Mm.
uh, in other professions, doing well. And I think in terms of our community, we've also had a change of mindset because previously we were kind of thinking we were migrant community. One day we probably return back home.
Mm.
Whereas I think today we are very much established in
Mm. Very
in
true.
the UK
Yeah.
as a sort of British Bengali community in our, I don't know, third, fourth generation. So I think the future
And
is
funny you should say that, I'm sorry, because I remember speaking to an academic, a few months ago, and he was saying how he was proud of the Asian community. He was a
yeah,
non-BAME person, and he was saying, especially the Bangladeshi and the Pakistani community, like if our elders or forefathers hadn't had that mindset, we
yeah,
probably would have been much more successful, much more successful in this country, because we
yeah,
proved over time that we, given the platform, we can succeed.
yeah,
Bengalis
yeah,
who came here from Bangladesh or Pakistan or India, we've done much better,
yeah.
in terms of like education, work, business, and whatnot. And even now, like Bengalis are really like, there was a stat in 2000 where in that statistics, they showed like the most number of immigrants who are going to university were from the Bangladeshi community, which is a
That's good
achievement
to
in
know.
itself, it's
Yeah,
very good to
yeah,
know. And
exactly.
we are making strides, but we're far behind the Indian community. I think we need to follow the Indian community and the Jewish community, because they really, you have to have that ethos, the hardworking ethos, the discipline. This is what the
Yeah,
Indian and the Jewish community have. I mean, I think we need to really, look towards them and how they, do things and how they succeed. And
yeah,
basically, but I really feel that there's a bright future out there for the Bangladeshi community, and we are making strides. In almost every household we have a graduate. We have not one graduate, few graduates. People are doing decent jobs nowadays. People are actually entering all sectors nowadays. So yes, so with that in mind, I'm going to end the show, and thank you once again, Ansar Bhai, for coming. I'll probably invite you at
thank you.
a later date sometime. Yeah. And
Okay.
thank you all for watching. And until the next episode, goodbye.